Hello, everyone. My name is Guy Lancaster, and I serve as the editor of the online Encyclopedia of Arkansas, which is based in the Bobby L. Roberts Library for Arkansas History and Art. The Roberts Library is located in downtown Little Rock, across Rock Street from the main library, and houses the galleries at Library Square and the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies. During the pandemic, the Central Arkansas Library System branches are offering curbside service to patrons to pick up their library materials, and you can use our Ask a Librarian or Ask a Genealogist service to get your research questions answered via phone or email. Branches are now allowing a limited number of patrons into buildings by appointment to use computers, fax items, and other services. For more details about all these services, go to cals.org. You can even visit us in the Roberts Library by appointment now. The Roberts Library Research Room and the galleries at Library Square will be open on a limited basis Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 9 to 11 a.m. and again from 1 to 5 p.m. The 9 to 11 a.m. time slot will be set aside exclusively for high-risk populations. During these hours, both the galleries and the research room will take appointments and allow a very limited number of walk-up visitors. For more information, go to robertslibrary.org. And of course, we're doing lots of virtual programming while we're closed or open. These include story times, cooking classes, craft activities, and podcasts. You can find most of these programs archived on CAL's YouTube channel. Just go to youtube.com and search for the Central Arkansas Library System. Subscribe to the channel to get notification when the latest videos are posted, and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to fill your feed with fun and educational content. One of the things we're doing at Roberts Library is collecting your stories, photos, and art relating to the COVID-19 experience of Arkansans. We did a similar collecting initiative last year during the Arkansas River flood. Please go to robertslibrary.org for more information or to submit your photographs and stories. We want to hear from you and consider your story important to Arkansas history. Now to this evening's program, titled Cows, Contagion, and Conflict, Federal Efforts to Eradicate Tick Fever and Local Resistance in Arkansas History, with Dr. Blake Perkins. Blake Perkins is an associate professor of history and chair of the Department of History and Political Science at Williams Baptist University. He is author of Hillbilly Hellraisers, Federal Power and Populist Defiance in the Ozarks, and editor of Yesterday, Today, Life in the Ozarks, which is currently on sale for 25% off at the website of the University of Arkansas Press. Perkins is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Arkansas Historical Association, and he also wrote an essay on the subject of tonight's presentation for the Arkansas Times, which you can find online. If you have any questions, feel free to add them into the chat on Zoom anytime during the talk, and we'll have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. This is also being broadcast on YouTube, but please don't leave any questions there. And with that, I will turn this over to Dr. Perkins.
Hello, Guy. Can you hear me?
Yes, you are broadcasting.
All right, good deal. All right, well, thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to be here tonight, and I appreciate Heather, her helping me out with the technical side of all this. Looks like we're up and running, so good deal. All right, and thanks to all those who are joining tonight. I look forward to maybe some conversation, maybe a few questions after the presentation here. We're going to Heather is going to be controlling my slides, and so I'll have to let her know when I want to switch slides, so just bear with me on that. All right, local farmer and businessman Charles Jeffrey left his house near Jamestown in Independence County around daybreak on Monday morning, March the 20th, 1922. He had been hired as an inspector for the U.S. Department of Agriculture's tick eradication campaign in its battle to eliminate the contagion of Texas tick fever, and he was charged with the difficult job of enforcing a mandatory quarantine on livestock in a particularly troublesome district south of Batesville. Slides, please. Local cattle farmers there had already gone through the burdensome and expensive requirement of driving their open range livestock to concrete vats in the area to have them dipped in an arsenic-based pesticide once every 2 weeks, and had hoped that the unpopular and many believed unnecessary mandate was finally behind them. But when Jeffrey and his fellow inspectors discovered more tick-infested cattle with symptoms of Texas fever, the quarantine and mandate were reimposed. Already disgruntled farmers were outraged, and notices threatening violence and destruction of property began to circulate. Night riders even began blowing up dipping vats with dynamite under the cover of darkness. Next slide, please. It was in this explosive atmosphere that Charles Jeffrey met up with his fellow inspector, Lee Harper, on Hutchinson Mountain at about 7:30 a.m. that cool March morning in 1922. Jeff found Harper in a state of panic when he arrived. Harper had been quail hunting that morning with some buddies and had heard a rumor that opponents of the tick eradication campaign had promised to start killing inspectors. Harper tried to talk Jeffrey into canceling the scheduled cattle dipping that morning, but Jeffrey, who had already received several other threats during the past few days, told Harper that they had a job to do and needed to get to work. So as they and their horses hiked along a dirt road toward the local dipping station, a shotgun blast fired from behind some thick brush cut Jeffrey down and hit Harper in the right arm. While Jeffrey lay there gasping for his last breaths, his lungs filled with buckshot, Harper begged the concealed assassin to spare him and scurried to the nearest farmhouse. During the next 2 weeks, while local, state, and federal law enforcement tracked down and jailed some suspects, chaos persisted in the district as night riders dynamited and set fire to the property of farmers and businessmen who supported and were involved with the quarantine order and tick eradication program. Despite several arrests, no one was ever convicted of murdering Charles Jeffrey. Jeffrey's assassination was part of a broader tick war that swept through the South during the early 20th century. Next slide, please. Despite concern to educate the public about the disease, the economic costs and inconveniences of the disease control mandate caused many people, many small farmers to lash out many small farmers lashed out with a populist antipathy toward government officials, agricultural experts, and veterinary scientists who were administering the program. It was common too for opponents to ridicule and intimidate fellow farmers and ordinary citizens who were known to support, or in some cases even comply, with the tick eradication program. As divisive and nasty, even prone to violence in a handful of cases like Independence County, and as much as misinformation and distrust of scientists and experts fueled reactionary attitudes, much of the local resistance to the quarantine and tick eradication program, nevertheless, was actually quite rational, as we will explore in some detail later on. Since this past March, with the ongoing pandemic, many historians have done some really good work, I think, in raising historical perspectives that help us to think about our current situation, the coronavirus. A lot has been done, for instance, comparing and contrasting our current situation with the great influenza of 1918, the so-called Spanish flu. The often forgotten campaigns in the United States to combat animal-borne diseases like Texas fever and bovine tuberculosis during the late 19th and early 20th centuries also offer some very compelling and timely historical insights. And so that's what we're going to be talking about this evening. And I think as we talk about these issues, the federal government's approach to eliminate these animal-borne diseases, and also much of the local resistance that it spawned, I think you'll find some things that are strikingly familiar with our own situation right now. If you would go to the next slide, please. Economists Alan Olmstead and Paul Rhode published a book, Arresting Contagion, Science, Policy, and Conflicts Over Animal Disease Control in 2015, published by Harvard University Press. This book recounts the history of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Bureau of Animal Industry, which doesn't exist any longer. As we'll see later, it was discontinued in actually folded into some other programs in 1942 during World War II. But it was created by Congress in 1884, and it fought many wars, waged many wars against animal and human diseases in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Got a quote there from the book, as you can see there. The authors state that the federal agency evolved to overcome great obstacles, including ignorance, rampant disease, denialism, constitutional impediments, knotty jurisdictional conflicts, and strong grassroots resistance to make the United States a world leader in controlling contagious animal diseases. And so I think Olmstead and Rhode in this book make a really compelling case that the Bureau of Animal Industry and all of its work and successes in eliminating many of these animal-borne diseases have been a very overlooked part of U.S. history and really even world history. You know, it kind of take it for granted today, but they are in this book again telling that agency story. So if you would go to the next slide. The Bureau of Animal Industry, and I'll refer to that as the BAI for short, was headed by this guy right here, Dr. Daniel E. Salmon. He was the founding director. Salmon was actually the first doctor of veterinary medicine in the United States. He studied at Cornell University, and of course would go on in his career, not just with the Bureau of Animal Industry, but in the field of veterinary medicine, to be a major player. And even after he left the Bureau of Animal Industry in 1905, he went to South America and was a director of a national veterinary school there. So had a pretty major career. And Salmon, as the director, of course, he had a lot of contacts in the veterinary medicine field and was able to assemble a really pretty remarkable cadre of veterinarians, scientists to this team, to Bureau of Animal Industry, and as they began to tackle many of these animal-borne diseases. And there's, as you can see, there's a list there. All in all, there were 7 major diseases that were eliminated by the Bureau of Animal Industry and its work. And so, as you can see, the last one there, Texas fever, which is what we're going to refer to or focus on a little bit more in this talk this evening. But in addition to these 7 major diseases that the BAI was able to help eradicate, a major point that Olmstead and Rhode make in their book was that how the BAI's campaigns targeting these specific diseases really led to even newer discoveries and new science and new medical breakthroughs. If you would go on to the next slide. So really the authors argue, I think quite persuasively, that there were compounded dividends, I guess you might say here. So as the agency would target one specific disease and begin to do the science of figuring that disease out and eventually coming up with treatments, it made all kinds of other discoveries that were linked. And so just some examples here. While working on efforts to get a handle on hog cholera, which was a major problem in rural areas, BAI scientists discovered salmonella. And so salmonella was named after Director Salmon. So if you didn't learn anything else tonight, you maybe figured out where salmonella came from. And also, its discovery that an arthropod vector, the cattle tick, as it was working to eliminate Texas tick fever, it's discovered that an arthropod vector transmitted a microorganism that was responsible for spreading Texas fever, led to other advancements in the science and treatments for malaria, for yellow fever, typhus, and African sleeping sickness, along with several other diseases. But the BAI also identified the hookworm parasite that had long plagued southern families. You can see here just a photograph found on the web. Hookworm was a terrible disease that really hit rural communities hard, including here in Arkansas, and especially in the South. But in the BAI also made the first ever use of an artificially heat-killed culture to produce a vaccine. And so those are just a few examples of again, how this public investment in the BAI produced exponential benefits. Moreover, while the BAI's mission aimed specifically at advancing animal health and veterinary science, its work, as we've already noted by mentioning hookworm, salmonella, and other diseases, also advanced human health and human medicine. To give one other example of that, the BAI's eradication of bovine tuberculosis, successfully eradicated bovine tuberculosis in 1940. And this was a disease that passed to humans through milk. It saved not only thousands of cattle, of course, but also the lives of about 25,000 people a year from deaths related to that particular disease. So again, while it was targeting specifically animal-borne diseases and how they affect animals, human medicine was advanced because of many of the breakthroughs in the science. Okay, next slide, please. Another major point I think is interesting and worth considering from historical perspective as we think about the BAI and its fight against these animal-borne diseases, these contagions. Olmstead and Rhode make a strong case that these disease eradication campaigns really expose the limits of localism, volunteerism, and individualism. And those first couple of quotes there are really getting at that point there. A laissez-faire regime relying on the tort system and local police powers could not protect life and property against animal contagions. And contrary to popular assertions, local representatives were not more efficient managers than faraway federal bureaucrats when it came to arresting livestock contagions. And so, if we think about it, I think there's some parallels to some of what we're seeing today. If just left up to voluntarism and individualism. So let's say Farmer Joe, in the case of the Texas tick fever, he takes the disease seriously and he complies with all of the recommendations and mandates that these agricultural officials and veterinary scientists are wanting him to try to keep his livestock healthy and so forth. But let's say across the fence, his neighbor, Farmer Bill, thinks this is just all a big hoax. He's not going to have anything to do with it. He doesn't comply. Well, guess what? Despite Farmer Joe's efforts and the expense he's going to try to eradicate this disease and do his part, those ticks crawl over from Farmer Bill from his pastures as well. And so you kind of get the point there. I think this required a more concerted, more collective campaign to make this work. And And also, as far as local governments go, I found some evidence, published evidence, newspapers, and again, this is somewhat familiar to some of our own times, I think, right now, of local officials, local government officials, county sheriffs, county judges, and so forth, in Van Buren County. I remember reading a newspaper account there published, and they said they would not, despite these federal state mandates to fight this Texas tick fever, so forth. They vowed that they would not enforce it in their county until they were convinced that a majority of the population favored it. And so, once again, I think that's a pretty important part of this story. Again, the limits of localism, volunteerism, and individualism there. And furthermore, along those lines, because this did require such a massive, broad-scale campaign, really at the national level, Olmstead and Rhode, in their book, make the case that the BAI represented a landmark in the history of federal regulation and the rise of science policy. So, historians often talk about this era, late 19th, early 20th century, as the era in which the modern state, is rising here. And the BAI certainly was a major part of that, overlooked, but or often forgotten, but certainly a major part. We often think about the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, the Meat Inspection Act of 1891, and of course a whole assortment of legislation during the Progressive era. But really, the BAI was vested with a level of federal authority that really hadn't been seen before, outside of wartime, at least, and charged with these powers to eliminate these diseases. So again, it plays a major role in the larger history, I think, of again, that rise of the modern state and so forth. Let's go to the next slide, please. Still talking here about Olmstead and Rhode's book and the history of the BAI. And so here's just some, I think, some big takeaways, some conclusions that they draw in their study there. First of all, as already mentioned, Olmstead and Rhode really give high marks to the BAI, especially considering all the obstacles that it faced, all the resistance, and we'll get into more of the resistance, particularly Texas tick fever, in just a minute. But they write that few nations were as successful as the United States in converting science into effective public policies to control animal contagions. They also, kind of along the lines that in the previous slide we just came from here, they argue that in the case of the BAI and its success here, that successful large-scale government interventions were possible. So again, once again, large-scale federal level cooperation with the states and localities involved in all this as well. Preparation was crucial, they argue, in being able to combat these diseases and ultimately eliminate them. I mean, the science, they had to have their ducks in a row, I guess you'd say, as they started in on this. Leadership mattered. Again, I think we're familiar to our own times here. Leadership matters. And leadership mattered in this case. I didn't see any in any of my research on the resistance to tick eradication. I didn't see any U.S. presidents really weighing in on that. Keep in mind, this is more of a targeted campaign targeting the agricultural sector, and really even within the agricultural sector, it's just targeting these livestock growers. And so, unlike our own times, where everyone, is affected. I didn't really see any evidence. That doesn't mean they weren't, but I didn't see any examples of presidents weighing in. I believe I did see a remark or two from Governor Charles Ruff, who was governor of Arkansas during the time, trying to back the agricultural officials who were carrying this out, and really try to get across the seriousness of the campaign and so forth. And then incentives mattered, say Olmstead and Rhode, and I will talk a little bit more about incentives in just a little bit. But there had to be incentives here to get people to comply and to deal with, put up with the inconveniences and the costs that it required to defeat these diseases. And so, lastly here, as I've already mentioned, they argue that the BAI's disease eradication campaigns really is a story of achievements that are now largely taken for granted. But we enjoy in our own times the successes that the agency had. All right, if you would move on to the next slide, please. Despite the BAI's stellar contributions to the science and the methods of disease control, the agency and its work were certainly not without problems, and its measures oftentimes fueled socioeconomic inequities, which in turn escalated the intensity of noncompliance and local resistance. Its shortcomings give us some very timely reminders, I think, about the need for serious federal accountability and oversight when it comes to implementing disease control programs and distributing government assistance. So what often happened is that the federal agency, the Bureau of Animal Industry, it put its scientists to work on this, develop these methods, provided the monies to carry them out, federal money to carry them out, but they often pretty much handed things down to the states to control and localities. And so they surrendered a lot of that oversight to state and local officials to carry these things out. And so that often came with problems, as we'll see here. A major theme, I think, of the tick eradication programs, one of the major shortcomings is, and one of the as we'll see later, one of the major complaints that many of these small farmers who opposed these programs made against the program was that it was largely gotten up for and controlled by wealthier cattle growers and so forth, and kind of benefited the elites at the expense of the smaller livestock growers and so forth. So there certainly were problems in all of that. Its history underscores the need for fairness and equity when it comes to both sharing the burdens and in offering aid. Not only, I think, is this socially responsible, but it is important for encouraging greater compliance and minimizing resistance. The BAI often came up short on these fronts. And again, I think we can learn something from looking at some of the mistakes it made here. So we're going to turn now back to focus more specifically on Texas tick fever and the eradication campaign there. Really, this all began in 1891, and it began when northern stockyards began to, and cattle growers, but especially stockyards, began to complain about southern cattle that were being shipped up to these northern stockyards and carrying these tick-infested southern cattle and carrying Texas fever to the northern cattle. And so a lot of complaining going on there from those stockyards. And so in 1891, a quarantine was put into place to protect these northern stockyards. And the map that's shown here on the slide, the black line there, shows the quarantine line, 1891. Effectively, what this did was it placed an embargo on southern cattle and stock dealers there. So there were ways that southern cattlemen could ship their cattle to stockyards in the north. And by the way, I should mention this is very important because that's where all the cattle went. There were very, very few meat packing houses in the south, and so they needed this market. They needed to move those cattle to those northern stockyards. Really, there were the only way they could do that with this quarantine in place was that during a window of time during the winter months when the ticks weren't as bad, they allowed exceptions, and so southern cattle could be shipped up during that time. Or the second way was that they would be loaded up on railroad cars, kept away from all the other cattle, and they had to be explicitly marked as quarantine cattle, right? So when they arrived in the northern stockyards, they didn't just mix them in with other cattle. They had to, put them in their own separate pens apart, so they couldn't mix with other cows. So, but this, of course, really hampered the trade, as you can imagine, there for southern cattlemen. So this was many southern agricultural and business interests, politicians were outraged by this 1891 cattle quarantine, including one of Arkansas's U.S. senators, James Berry. He was one of the most vocal in complaining about this quarantine measure. However, between over the next decade or so, as the USDA and Congress began to float some more money out there for agricultural development and so forth, many of these southern agriculturalists and business owners, politicians, actually kind of made a transition. They went from being very vocal opponents to being major supporters if they could get their hands on some of these federal dollars, some of these development funds that they could use there. And so Berry himself actually became a major supporter. And by 1906, it was actually Southern congressmen who spearheaded an effort which led to a pretty major allocation of monies by Congress for this Southern tick eradication campaign. And so that the campaign then began in 1906. And like I said, worked from the federal level of Bureau of Animal Industry, worked with states and localities to get this thing going. Actually, in Arkansas, it started in the northwestern part of the state. We're in the Fayetteville and Bentonville area, and made its way across to the east there. As you can see, the Missouri line, most of Missouri was out of the quarantine. You can see a few areas there in south central Missouri that were under the quarantine, at least for a while. But so they began working their way through to do this. These supporters of the tick eradication campaign really they never saw opposition or resistance coming. It doesn't seem. They expected everyone to welcome this campaign. They saw it as a progressive measure in which all farmers would benefit. Why not? Let's get rid of ticks. Your cattle will be healthier. They'll be worth more. Everybody will be happy. But they quickly began to realize, as they began to carry out these local campaigns, county by county, district by district, that not everyone was interested in complying, especially, as it turns out, smaller, poorer cattle farmers. They were having a hard time getting them to comply with all they needed to do to get this done. If you would go to the next slide. So once again, really one of the big pushes by these veterinary scientists and agricultural officials was to educate. And again, they thought if we can educate these farmers about the disease, how it works, how it's spread, and what we can do to eliminate it, everyone will be on board, and we'll have this thing whipped in no time. Like I said, that's not the way it's going to go, though. And so go ahead to the next slide. There were differences among cattle farmers. And I think these differences among these cattle farmers, especially socioeconomic differences, are really a big part of this story. So let's talk about a few of those in just a minute. This picture is actually not from Arkansas. I think I got this from a Texas history site, but I wanted to use it because I think I can illustrate a few points here by doing this. Again, maybe if you just take a look at this, well, there's cows, farmer there, some land, all that stuff. But I can look at this picture, and I'm pretty confident in saying that this is a fairly well-to-do, certainly more prosperous cattle farm operation here. And a couple of things give that away. First of all, the breed of the cattle there, I believe they look like Herefords, purebred Herefords. This was an imported European breed, and so these are rather purebreds are rather expensive stock here. This is not the kind of cattle that your average Arkansas farmer was raising. And that comes out some in some of these veterinary reports, some of the agricultural extension reports and so forth. And they refer to a lot of the common cattle, making them distinct from the purebreeds like we're seeing in this picture. They refer to them as native scrub stock. And so these were cattle that they tended to be thinner, far less fleshy, smaller cattle. These were cattle that had been in the region for generations, just native stock, all the offspring over the generations, unlike these imported purebreds. Well, when it came to tick eradication and the problem of Texas tick fever, it was the kind of cattle that you see in this picture that were really showing major symptoms. I mean, it was really devastating for many of these pure breeds that had not been exposed to these ticks and this disease, this babesiosis that they carried. And so this was, highly deadly for many of these pure breeds. But the scrub cattle, so-called scrub cattle, that the majority, I think, of the smaller, poorer farmers in Arkansas had, the scrub cattle were not showing symptoms, really, very little in the way of symptoms. Veterinary scientists argued that, well, even they are being, even if you can't maybe see it as much, or maybe your the scrub cows aren't dying, but they are losing weight because of it, and that's probably true. But they certainly weren't falling over dead. This didn't seem to be a major problem for the average farmer. So think about that then. I mean, here comes the federal government with its tick eradication campaign, and then eventually mandates requiring you to comply to eliminate this disease. And for most of these farmers, I don't see the disease, right? It's not something real to me. I don't have these purebred cows. My cows are fine. Why am I having to do this? They have ticks. They've always had ticks. So that was a big issue. Again, those socioeconomic differences and the purebred cattle versus your scrub stock. Another difference that I want to point out and ask you to think about a little bit here, also illustrated in this picture, is that your more prosperous cattlemen tended to have more neatly fenced pastures, corrals and barns and so forth, so that they could manage their herds better. You can see the fences here in this picture. I mean, that in today's world, it just stands to reason. If you have cows, you have fences, right? That's not the way things were in the 1920s, in 1922, when Charles Jeffrey was killed in Independence County. These were still the days in most places of, especially certainly in rural areas. So these were still the days of the open range, and so the vast majority of these farmers didn't have fenced-in pastures, and their cattle ran around in the woods and wherever they pleased. Right. So think about that. Just the logistics of trying to get these cattle to the dipping vat and so forth, right? Where they're required to go dip these things every 2 weeks to get rid of the ticks. I mean, it was nearly an impossible task. Required all kinds of labor for them to be able to do that. They occasionally lost cattle along the way trying to do that. So that was a big problem. It was again a bigger burden for many of these smaller and poorer farmers. Finally, dipping vats were typically located on the farms of your more well-to-do cattlemen. All right, and these people were paid for that, right? So they got the dipping vats built on their place, easier for them to get their cattle there, and all the other farmers in the area, maybe even more than a mile away, had to bring their cattle to them. And inspectors, Charles Jeffrey, for instance, by local standards, he was a wealthy man. He owned 2 farms. He was a merchant. He owned a sawmill. He had the contract to carry the U.S. mail in his area. So a lot of these farmers, again, saw this as just something gotten up by, the more well-to-do farmers to kind of butter their own bread, that kind of thing. And then finally, I also want to mention another big reason for the resistance was the local tax that was imposed to help pay for this. Now, most of this is federal funds, but there was a requirement that states and localities, pitch in and to pay their parts of the cost of this. And so, Arkansas decided to do that by imposing a 2-cent per head flat tax. And so, this really, 2 cents per head. I said, well, but that could add up, especially if you continue to have to dip them every 2 weeks and keep bringing them back. That could add up. And while a lot of these wealthier farmers saw this as something well worth the expense, again, if you're one of those poor farmers, my cows don't even seem to be sick. I'm having to pay people to help me round these cattle up, try to get them here. It takes sometimes a couple of days, maybe even to do that. And then on top of that, I have to pay this tax to have it done. So there were some pretty logical reasons for some of the resentment there. All right, next slide, please. Obviously, I do want to point out, obviously, that most of the resistance wasn't nearly as extreme and violent as what happened there in March 1922 in Independence County. In fact, to my knowledge, there was one other murder of an inspector in Georgia, but to my knowledge, those are the only 2 murders that occurred throughout this whole campaign. There were, as we've mentioned, many instances of night riders blowing these dipping vats up with dynamite and things like that, all kinds of intimidation and so forth. But probably the most common form of resistance, I guess, was non-compliance. And we see here, this is from a local newspaper. I think this is actually from the Melbourne paper in the time here. Most of those who didn't want to comply with this didn't comply with it, and they either got by with it or they got caught. And in this case, this is a farmer who apparently must have gotten caught. 1 Jersey cow and calf, 1 Jersey male yearling, and 1 Jersey heifer yearling. They were, as you can see, confiscated Guyan, Arkansas. It's in Guyan's in Stone County, I believe. And you can see what the penalty is here. They're selling them to the highest bidder for the purpose of paying the charge of dipping and the cost of the sale. So yeah, I mean, some farmers did get by with it, but as these inspectors really did their work, inspectors like Jeffrey, some farmers were caught who did not comply, and they had their cattle in some cases confiscated from them. Go ahead and go to the next slide, if you would. I also wanted to point out that while resistance and opposition was rampant, really from 1906 on, from the beginning of this tick eradication program, the worst years, the most intense resistance, and unfortunately, in many cases, most violent resistance came after World War I. And I think that is related to the economic situation, particularly the beef, the cattle market during that time. So take a look at this. If you take a look at this graph, you can see here what World War I did to the cattle market. It doubled the price of cattle per 100 pounds there from 1911 to 1918. And so what a lot of these, especially a lot of poorer farmers, and I've looked particularly in the Jeffrey murder case in Independence County. I took many of those who were arrested or even accused of being involved, and I was able to look at personal property records, and it's quite remarkable to take a look at how those poor hill farmers were responding to these markets right here that we're looking at. The numbers of cattle are going up. Their herds are getting larger. Many of them, there were some instances where they appeared to have sold many of their hogs and turned around and bought more cattle to try to take advantage of these higher cattle prices. So it's pretty remarkable. But as you can see, what happens after 1918, and especially as we get into the early 20s, Europe gets back on its feet after the war. The unusual demand at the time for such unusual demand for American agricultural products begins to taper back off, and you can see what happens to the market there. By 1922, the same year that Charles Jeffrey is murdered, we were right back where we were in 1911. So this is a time of serious frustration. I found several instances where some of these farmers had taken out mortgages, so they're in trouble as this market begins to tank. And so keep that in mind. At the same time, they're worried about this market situation. Here they are with this tick eradication program that they must comply with, and the expense and burdens that they're facing there with that. So I think that's a big part of the equation as well. Okay, if you would go to the next slide. So, as we've seen, this was not a popular program at all with the smaller common farmer, and it led itself to this the spread, I guess, of denialism. That this is a problem, or here's an example, I think, of this. And once again, it touches on that nerve, that assumption that this is a program for the rich boys, and they're skinning it off our backs here. This is as you can see, it's Fox correspondent from Stone County Record. This will be a lonesome old place to live when the tick eradicators get all the ticks eradicated. They may eradicate for 1,000 years, and there will not be any difference in the amount of ticks. The one tick thereafter is a big round tick. I call it $1. When they are all eradicated, then the ticks will all be gone. The poor we have with us always. I think that kind of captures the mood of a lot of these small farmers at this time. And, oftentimes agricultural officials, those trying to get across the seriousness of the campaign, didn't help themselves out, with some of the things that they said. I'll give you an example of that. And of course, as they misspoke or made an exaggerated claim, that would just be something that the opponents would just latch onto to try to further discredit it. And so an example of that, the state commissioner of agriculture here in Arkansas during the time was Clay Sloan. And he was quoted as stating that trying to get across the seriousness of Texas tick fever and the need to get this disease eradicated. He was quoted in the newspaper as claiming that one tick can draw 200 pounds of blood from one animal in a season. Well, the editor of the Batesville Guard, there in Independence County, while the editor argued that he was a supporter of the tick eradication program, but he took Commissioner Sloan to the woodshed on this, mocking him as an expert statistician. And here's what was written in that editorial in the Batesville Guard. Why, the dreaded blood-sucking vampires of India, or the gorgeously and most stupendously advertised blood-sweating behemoth of olden circus fame, would have no odds on one of those hideous tick monsters with a capacity of a pound of blood a day. Frankly, we do not believe in such far-drawn and imaginative arguments. And it is just such freak statements which have caused so much ridicule and opposition to an otherwise intelligent campaign of education. So once again, opponents would take these kinds of misstatements and so forth, and really, like I said, try to further discredit the entire campaign with them. Once again, I think something that we're seeing a little bit of in our own time today. All right, well, I believe that's all I've got for now. I'll pass it back over to Guy or Heather or whoever wants to take it, and then we'll maybe do some questions if we have time.
Okay, we do have a few questions if you've got a moment.
Sure. And Guy, before we start, I was seeing some stuff popping up on my screen, but I couldn't.
Yeah, no, I'll read them to you. Don't worry about it.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, so I think you answered this one. One person asked, were there other federal agents murdered while enforcing cattle dipping? You mentioned.
Yeah. Well, the only other one I know of was in, I think it was Eccles County, Georgia. That's the only other one I know of. Only other assassination or murder. Yeah.
But any harassment, whipping, tarring, feathering?
I know of one attempt, at least, in Izard County. In the one of the inspectors there claimed that he was run into the woods by some night riders one night and had to hide out, I think, in a ditch to get away from them. They were about to impose a little vigilante justice, I guess, there on him. And there are probably others, but I can't think of any specific examples. But yeah, that happened for sure. And for those who might be interested in that, there is a book that is I forget when it was published, but it's on the broader South, the tick eradication campaign by historian Claire Strom, and the title is you'll have to remember the title. It's called "Making Catfish Bait Out of Government Boys," is the name of the title of that book. But it's a history of really the opposition and resistance to the tick eradication campaign in the South. And so, yeah, if anybody's interested in that, there are many other stories and of again, violence and so forth in that.
Yeah, I mean, so would you say that being a tick inspector, cattle inspector, was actually dangerous, or was this a lot of overheated rhetoric?
So I think it got dangerous for sure. In Charles Jeffrey's case, from what I understood from that, I did some oral histories. This is still talked about by some of the old timers in that Hutchinson Mountain community and so forth. But the story, and I heard it from a couple of accounts that are doing some oral histories, was that Charles Jeffrey had actually been opposed to the tick eradication program, but then was hired as an inspector. And so he changed his tune, pretty quickly there, and that just enraged the locals there and knew him. I mean, here he had been with us before, and now they're paying this guy to do, So, and yet again, like I said earlier, he was a man of means, especially by local standards there. So yeah, I think he pretty well had a bullseye on his back. And but yeah, after Jeffrey was murdered, the county supervisor over the whole campaign there suspended all eradication efforts until federal marshals arrived to quell the violence. So yeah, it could be rough to be an inspector for sure.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about Texas tick fever, like as a disease? I mean,
I was afraid you were.
But, I don't necessarily mean as give us an epidemiology, but how dangerous was it to cattle, or how was it more dangerous to profits, or what?
Yeah, well, my understanding of the disease is that it, and again, I'm not a veterinary scientist, and but my understanding from what I've read is that the disease attacks, I guess, is the white blood cells. Anyway, basically made the cattle anemic.
Okay.
To the point where they, exhibited massive weight loss and, to the point of death oftentimes. But as I said earlier, it tended to, the symptoms showed far more in purebred cattle. Whereas the scrub stock, maybe it had built up some level of immunity over the years, so it didn't seem to be affecting them, certainly not killing them like it was the others. But yeah, I don't know as much. There's actually an older article in the Journal of Southern History, and I forget that historian's name, but she delves more into the science, the science of the disease and so forth. Yeah.
Okay, so last one looks like public health initiatives often had kind of a propaganda component, appealing to patriotic sentiment, for example. Like during the flu pandemic, there are patriotic posters promoting mask wearing. Was there any sort of PR effort relating to tick fever and cattle dipping?
Yes, there was, and I saw some instances in during World War I. Yeah, and there would be, yeah. I can't think of any quotes or anything off the top of my head, but there was some of that mixing of, support the red, white, and blue, go dip your cattle kind of thing. I mean, it was, and another thing I should mention too, along those lines, is that especially after the war, increasingly opponents of tick eradication were probably one of the most effective, I think, campaigns to, overcome the opposition was to paint them as Bolsheviks.
Okay.
The opponents as Bolsheviks, and so one of the more vocal groups that opposed tick eradication was the Working Class Union out in some of them in rural Oklahoma and a few of them in Arkansas, and so anytime someone opposed or was accused of opposing tick eradication, it's in most of the newspapers. In fact, in the Charles Jeffrey murder case, one of them was accused, and they're probably right on this guy, accused of being a rural socialist, and that he must have been the ringleader, and all this stuff. But anyway, yeah. So kind of painting them, portraying them as un-American, as communists and so forth. That was a common tactic. Yeah,
You know, that is interesting because there was a lot of rural draft resistance
that's
during
right.
World
Yeah,
War One in Arkansas and the Ozarks and Ouachitas, and I hadn't thought about draft resistance as sort of running parallel to resistance to cattle dipping.
and since you brought that out, there were several arrested for Jeffrey's murder, but one of those who was arrested, um, I think it was the very first thing when they brought him in to question him and so forth was, where were you during the war? He had hidden out. He had resisted the draft during the war, and so the prosecution tried to use that angle to, well, this guy's no good. He's just a troublemaker, probably a murderer, right? And so, so those things came together in this case as well. Yeah.
Huh. Well, it's been interesting. It's been delightful, and I think you're right. I think there are a lot of parallels to our present moment for good and ill, and we really appreciate you being here and doing this.
All right. Well, thanks again, Guy. I appreciate you having me and enjoyed it.
And again, folks, Blake's new book, Yesterday, Today. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Available at University of Arkansas Press website at 25% off. His previous book, Hillbilly Hellraisers, available from University of Illinois Press. Can find it anywhere. Blake Perkins, thank you for being with us, and we'll chat with you later.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Take care.